At home, I had started developing film I had found in old cameras, and I saw that there was a world beyond ours. A world that could only be found through hard work and superior intelligence, or by the unlucky. A world whose fragile barrier is sometimes found shattered in the dark room.
"This is what I wanted to show you," said Richard. He gestured to the end of the dim room, past the brick walls that had been covered so thickly with black paint that it made the bricks smooth, and it had dripped down and dried on the cheap linoleum tile, and to a rough plywood table in the corner where the machine was sitting. When I saw it, I was taken aback. "This is an enlarger?" I asked. "This is more than an enlarger," said Richard. "This machine will show you the hidden side of a person, their true self. I've heard that you are somewhat open-minded about these things." The device was a tangle of oxidized and corroded pipes. Connected to the top of the machine was a glass cylinder that was filled with a thin, milky liquid. Protruding from the bottom of the mess was a slightly wider pipe, rougher and darker than the rest, that projected down at the table towards a spot reserved for paper. "You don't believe me," said Richard. "Well, take a look for yourself." He reached under the plywood table and into a cabinet, where he retrieved a small box which he handed to me. In the box there were several small black and white photographs. At first glances, the people in the photos looked normal. But upon closer inspection, their figures were distorted and twisted into terrible aberrations. In some photos, their faces were blank. In others, their faces were normal, but their hands were long and claw-like, or they had slithering, whip-like appendages that protruded from random parts of their bodies. At first, I could be convinced that the photographs were the work of a pictorialist photographer, like William Mortensen. But then I recognized the face of one of the subjects, a 12-year-old boy that had gone missing several years ago. And then in the photos, another missing person, and then another. Expressionless, I gave him back the box, and for a moment, I thought I could see a slight smile on his face. "Where did you get this machine?" I asked. He ignored me and reached back into the wooden cabinet, pulled out a binder full of negatives. "It took me years to find this machine, and even longer to learn how to use it. It was a lot of hard work. But sometimes things take a little more than hard work, if you know what I mean." He looked at me. "I'm sure you know that sometimes these things are more of an art than a science. Here, let me show you something." He took a negative from the binder and inserted it deep into the maze of piping. "The process sensitizes the paper to all visible light, so I'm going to turn off the safe light. It's going to have to stay completely dark while I develop it, just to let you know, so that there are no surprises." The safe light switched off, and I could hear Richard rumbling around in the cabinet for a piece of paper to make a print with. In the darkness, I heard the hum of a mechanism, which was odd as I couldn't remember there being a plug or even an outlet for the enlarger. There was a deep pop, followed by a flash at the enlarger that illuminated Richard as he stood in front of the machine. and a shrill, glassy overtone rang out. And then, darkness, as I heard Richard working at the sink. As my eyes acclimated, I could hear Richard working at the sink, developing the print. By the time he was almost done, I could see a small sliver of light shining in from the other side of the room, where the door was poorly sealed, and it reflected off Richard's glasses as he went to turn on the safe light. I went over to the water bath where the print was soaking to take a look. It looked just like any normal photo. "Does it take time to show the change?" I asked. Richard grabbed one of the trays of chemicals and flung it into the wall at the other side of the room. "I did everything. This isn't right. Maybe the paper is bad." He exhaled. "I need to view this in the light. I will be right back." He left the door open when he went to take a look at the print, and I took a moment to check out the enlarging machine. The glass tank had a hairline crack that was only visible from certain angles, when the light hit it just right. I reached out to touch it, and I could feel cool air blowing from the crack. Richard returned, but before I could show him the defect, he pushed me aside. "Please," he said, "I'm the only one currently skilled enough to use this machine. If an amateur like yourself were to use it, well, it would create quite a mess. And I don't want to have to clean that up." He was holding a negative carrier. "That negative was imperfect. I'm going to use another. I'm sure that this will prove the device's efficacy." The room went dark, and I backed up to the side of the room and put my hand on the wall. Again, I heard the machine rumble and hum as it powered up. The bright flash went off, this time with a louder and more distinct sound, shrill and booming. Then it was quiet for a moment, until the dark silence was punctured by the glass container shattering. Richard let out a cry, and I could feel the vibration from his body hitting the ground. I pressed my back against the wall and yelled out for Richard. "Are you okay?" I heard his feet slipping on the floor as he tried to get up. From somewhere in the room, there came a deep, guttural noise. Richard frantically began to yell. He was cut off mid-sentence as I heard a terrible ripping sound and something hit the wall next to me, making a loud thud and splattering me with some unknown liquid. Some of the liquid got into my mouth, and I could taste the iron. This was blood. I began to retch and heave, and I convulsed so hard that I fell to my knees. Another guttural growl, but I couldn't tell from where. I felt the air move as something massive swung over my head. There was something else in the room with me. By now, my eyes had adjusted to the light, and the small crack near the door reflected light off the thick and oily fur of some large creature. It looked heavy-set, like a bear, but otherworldly, unnatural. The light from the door gave me a chance to adjust my bearings, so I had an idea of the layout of the room. I ran towards the exit with the hopes of reaching the door or even the light switch when I hit a wet patch on the slick linoleum, and I skidded across the floor. As I struggled with my balance, I tripped over the rumpled body of Richard, and I fell to the ground. When I hit the floor, I felt another swing over me, which hit the enlarger and sent it flying into the wall and showered me with small bits of metal. A larger metal pipe hit me in the leg, causing me to drop back down to the floor. By now, my squirming had covered me in whatever liquid was on the floor, and I could feel that the thing was near me. My leg was numb. It felt like this was going to be the moment that I died. and in desperation, I feebly reached out and felt my wet hand touch the cold, coarse fur of my unknown assailant. My hearing faded as time seemed to slow down. My consciousness felt like it was drifting out of my body, outside of itself. A deep, penetrating roar pulled me back in, and I shivered. A surprisingly weak blow tossed me across the room and into the sink. It knocked the air out of my lungs, but barely bruised me. I managed to grab a hold of the sink despite my clumsy wet hands, and I pulled myself up. There I was, standing in the dark, breathing heavily, and waiting for the next blow to come. But nothing came. With some effort, I managed to get myself over to where the door was and fumble for the light switch. When the lights flickered on, there was nothing but a trashed, empty room, and Richard's headless body splayed on the floor. The enlarger was smashed to pieces. You couldn't even tell that the parts were from the same machine. It took me a couple of minutes to calm down, even just a little bit. With a clearer head, I pulled out my phone and I called the police. About 35 minutes later, a police officer showed up at the house. "If I could just get you to wait in the living room while I check out the scene," he said. "I'll be back to speak with you in a moment." I sat on the couch and closed my eyes and tried to slow down my breathing. I was just starting to relax a little when the police officer returned. He took down my name and then told me I was free to go and that he'd contact me if they needed any additional information, but that would be unlikely. "It looks like a fairly standard suicide," he said. "Suicide?" I asked. His face was oddly expressionless, like the face of a doll. "Yes," he said. "It's very unfortunate for you that you had to discover the body." It was like he was looking through me. My clothes were still wet, and there was a significant amount of blood on my face. "Yes," he said. "It's very unfortunate, but thankfully, you can leave and go back to your normal life." Confused, I went to speak, but he interrupted me. "I'll walk you to your car." I pulled out of the driveway and looked into my rearview mirror to see the policeman still standing there, staring at me while I drove off. As he faded into the distance, he tapped his fingers to his head and did a little wave goodbye. Soon, I was on Route 157, heading home as the sun slipped behind the mountain and then was drifting away, along with everything that I'd seen. Richard and the machine, both broken beyond repair, and laid to rest, entombed in the dark room.